Um, and so I tried to do that. I tried to find a chef because I wasn't cooking. Um, and I tried to find try to find investors. And at one point, for like 12 seconds in history, I found all these things. And then in the 13th second, it all fell apart. And so I said to myself, fuck it, I'm just gonna do it myself. So I mean, I eat Nigerian food all the time. So I know what it tastes like. I just had to do the work to bridge so like my expertise with like the taste. So I called my mom, she lives in Nigeria. I called my aunt, she was in Detroit. And I sold some tickets and we had like 100 people the first dinner, and it was terrifying as fuck. I was like calling my auntie, I'm like, how do you make this shit again? As I was staring the pot. And I did that for like 6 months, and then I finally decided to leave my restaurant, and I was like, I'm going to travel and cook. And part of what I wanted to do was, I said to myself, like, my goal is to make Nigerian food commonplace without making it pedestrian. Because I felt like there was something about American food at the time, and still, and American food broadly, just like Eurocentric cuisine, that was pretentious and boastful without really offering anything beyond what was on the plate. So I'm saying all that to say that when I started, I had this sort of like implicit politics about what I was trying to do. I didn't give a fuck about the food. I just really cared about saying something beyond what the food could say. And so I traveled and I did this in like 8 whatever cities or something. And then I came to New Orleans, and I moved to New Orleans, opened up a spot in a food hall, and I did that for 5 months, and that ended. And so from September of 2015 to like December, I was just sort of like in this protracted state of just suspension, disorientation, if that's a word, I don't know. Trying to figure out like how to advance my politics, and how to be more specific about the things that I was trying to say. And this was the time, there was a spate of killings of unarmed black folks, rather like a spate of publicized killings. And so I think at that time, for a lot of people, Nigerians, Africans, and I guess the general American public, there was like a new sort of like racial consciousness like brewing. Like this idea of race was a thing. We had entered into this post-racial America after Obama was president, and there was this reminder that there's no such thing as that, especially when disparities as do exist up until the point of like death for like black folks. So, and I had always been, these questions I'd always contended with, like race and capitalism and stuff like that. But I had wanted to separate from my, to have my politics to a certain extent be buried, and also be frivolous, and just have a limited commentary. And so I decided, like maybe not consciously, but that it was time to like have my politics be more explicit, and that you can't. It's difficult to protest quietly. And so I started this series in March, and I started with a set of assumptions that I know now to be like fundamentally untrue, right? But before I started, I spent like 2 or 3, or maybe a month or 2, so I don't exaggerate shit here, but like a month or 2 like studying, like reading, because I realized that I'm Nigerian, and most Africans have been indoctrinated in a certain way to see the African American experience in a certain way, and that perspective is largely shaped by white supremacy. We are the victims of colonialism, and we also harbor like neo-colonial sort of like, I guess, self-hatred, you know? And so that manifests in many different ways. And we don't, at least for Nigerians, and I speak for Nigerians that I know and myself and my family, we don't see ourselves necessarily as kin with African Americans. So like I knew that I had to do this work of like trying to understand what it was I was going to say in my dinner series. And so I started, and I started in New Orleans, and I went to Detroit and Philly and Pittsburgh, Boston, Louisville, Oakland, San Francisco, Los Angeles, some other places, can't remember, and Detroit, and I did these dinners, and as I was doing these dinners, I was also like continuing the work, like reading and shit, but I'm lazy, so I don't like read all the time, but you know, I was trying. And the first thing that struck me was I had a meeting with this lady in Detroit, a white lady. She's white and lesbian, and she owned one of the most prominent restaurants in New Orleans. Actually, sorry, I had met with her because I met with a friend of hers, this other white lady, super rich, super wealthy. She sold her company for tens of millions of dollars, and then she decided to pivot away from insurance to work in education in New Orleans. And New Orleans is a predominantly, at least the New Orleans public school system serves predominantly African American kids. And so I was talking to her about the dinner series, about what I was doing, and I just asked offhand, like, so, I mean, do you read shit about like race shit? She was like, no, I don't need to. Like, I've been in conversations about race for 20 years. And she was described to me by folks in the community who were doing education work as a very problematic person. Which isn't to say that she wasn't coming from a good place. It's to say that the consequences of her actions disregarded the history, the work, and the context of where she was. And so that was like my first realization of this hubris that white people hold. You know, that you can somehow will into existence this knowledge. Like, you could have intimate awareness of the reality of other people by just like proximity or by smell or some shit. Like, you could just like figure it out. And I was like, in my head, I'm like, well, that's crazy, because like I recognized very quickly that I didn't know shit, and I still don't know shit. So like I'm gonna read, you know. And so that was the first thing. The other things that sort of happened was Sorry, I'm just texting my friends. I have to check my notes here. But the other things, the other things that I realized was we would be having conversations at the dinner. So right, so the dinner was, I think it started as predominantly black, and then it moved to like a mixed room, and it still stayed predominantly black, but you know, other like white folks became more present in the rooms. And what would happen is black folks would share, right? Share where they were coming from and the reality of being black in America, and white folks would be like so touched, you know, like so touched, and they would be like, all right, they would listen, and they'd be like, so what do we do, you know? But that wasn't like a question without, it wasn't a rhetorical question, and it wasn't a question without direction. It was usually a question, or exclusively a question directed at a black person. So and I was like, whoa, in my mind, and it happened this one time with this lady who was my co-host in Detroit, and she was sharing her experience as an artist in Detroit and some of the challenges that she faces. And this very kind older white man asked the question, and yeah, it's like I feel all this, but like, what do we do? And this very eloquent woman was like, she didn't know what to say. She was like, she was stuttering, and then I realized in that moment, like, that was like a very subtle way to disguise power as compassion. You know, to put the burden on the folks who have been marginalized, who have to suffer the indignities of oppression, and have them, create an answer for you. But even if there was an answer, right, to use language to encompass 400 years of bullshit and terrible stuff and violence and genocide and hate, to use this
one single answer.
Yeah, to create with words, this magic bullet. And then you can see the response to the reality that no response is adequate. Like, you could see from the white person, it was like almost like this, like yes, it's complicated, right? So almost like trying to prove a point. Like, the point is that race is complicated, and if you don't have the answer, well, let's all try and fix it together. That was the first thing. That was the first craziness that I saw. That I didn't even need to read a book to recognize how weird as fuck that shit was. And more interestingly, how commonplace in every place that I went to, that reaction was. Like, white people would just respond with it's time for a solution. And I'm like, but chill. It's not time for a solution right now. Because the trick there is that if you start to busy yourself on a solution, that you don't have to take responsibility. Mm-hmm. That you can get lost in the work of trying to figure something out. When even if there was a solution, it should at least, I think, reasonably take, if not the same amount of time that it took the question to, or the challenge or the problem to gestate and to mature, maybe at least half that time. So if there is a solution, if it's not a 400-year solution, maybe it's a 200-year solution, 150-year solution, it's definitely not a 20-minute solution, And so that sort of abject denial of logic in that space was what I realized. Another thing that I realized is the ability of white folks and people with privilege to just distance themselves from the question. And this happens all the time. It happened the last dinner. It's when black folks are sharing very personally their experience. White folks use distance, temporal distance and emotional distance, as a tool to empathize. And they bring up somebody in their family who was in the Confederate Army 100 years ago. I don't know how long ago that was. Or they bring up maybe somebody who exists contemporarily, but who they know of. This very a dance. It's impossible to acknowledge our role, our complicity in oppressive systems. It's just impossible. White folks just couldn't do it, And when they did, it was let me tell you about my grandfather, Let me tell you, a classic one, or it's a new classic that is happening, is let's talk about poor white people. Or let's talk about people that voted for Trump. I'm like, motherfucker, let's talk about you. How are we gonna go all the way to Trump? And so it's this very weird thing, and it wasn't it wasn't from a lack of, I don't know, like trying. It was just from an ineptitude.
Yeah.
That, but I'm not saying that to say that that's okay. I'm saying that to say that the consequences of that ineptitude are disastrous, and that ignorance is really a cover for privilege that white folks want to keep. You know, because you can think past your grandfather and you can like apprehend your own actions, and so like so that was the other thing, and then I think that what I then realized for me is how ill-equipped I am to have these sorts of conversations and discussions. As somebody who isn't from here, I see myself as black because that's my, I guess, color. You know, I see myself as Yoruba, as Nigerian. That's who I am, and I grew up there, and I come from a different like cultural perspective, and race isn't quite as real, or rather, race is non-existent in Nigeria. But what does happen in Nigeria is tribalism, ethnic sort of like competition. So to understand race in the American context intellectually, and to understand that it is a construct with devastating consequences, but to also be able to shift away from it and call my mother up, and she's talking about, you know, traveling to a city. She's talking about how I should pray every morning because like witches and wizards are like trying to kill me and shit, like, or to like hang out with my friends who are Nigerians, and you know they're talking about the conception of race isn't present, and to like live between those two spaces is for me to understand that African Americans in America do enormous work. Like their lives, like I was talking to Charlotte this morning about how like exhausted I was, you know, and I didn't do anything after the dinner. I think it was Wednesday. I didn't do anything today. I was just in bed all day. I was watching Batman vs Superman. Don't watch that shit. It's fucked up. And I was sleeping, and then that's all I did, because like that was the extent to which like I was affected by the dinner and the subsequent conversations about the dinner. And I was thinking, I have been thinking about how this is my reality by choice, but this is like black folks' reality by imposition. Like it's been imposed on black folks, and it's then it becomes annoying to me. Like I get angry, you know, that black folks have to do this work. White folks don't have to give really anything, even in a contrived space where what is asked of you is theoretical and conceptual. Like I would ask in my dinners, what are you willing to give up? People can't form a coherent response, and the honest ones say nothing. I mean, they aren't quiet. They say they're willing to give up nothing. And so like this is where I've come, right? To this place where I've recognized for me that in a sense, and this is sort of like what was painful, like in a sense, because of my limited knowledge and my emotional shallowness, that I have played into this very like insidious and real aspect of white supremacy, which is to consume and to co-opt, like in such a voracious way, you know, and so that I can, in sort of like my problematic attempt to get white folks to think differently, exploit the emotions and the labor of black folks in an attempt to make this happen. And this is like a true story. Like everywhere I go, and even more so now, we do these dinners, and I swear to God, like I see white folks, and I just see like a blank stare. Like motherfuckers just don't get it, you know. And I'm like, fuck. Like we've just like taken a bunch of black folks, and they've said some shit that is real, and white folks are like, kind of like struggling and shit, just like the way they dance. Just kidding. But they're struggling to like apprehend something, and then they hit the first wall of like honesty and vulnerability and this like necessary paradigmatic shift, and they just can't do that. And so like I'm just left like, you know, like what is the thing to do? And I called Charlotte, and we spoke about this last night. I called my mother because I couldn't sleep, and she was like, she said some problematic things too. But she was like, she said, you know, re-strategize. And she was comforting, and it was good to talk to her. But like this is the reality that I find in my life with this dinner series. It's like every step, that the work that it takes to create the sort of equitable society that we need is work that requires growing a new appendage, you know, like the like to the extent that you can physically grow a new arm, is where white folks and other black folks really need to go to think critically about how to create equity. And the dinners are great, whatever. I was talking, I think Justin is here, but I was talking to him, and he said something to me yesterday. He was like, you know, this, you know, is a public success, maybe, you know, like, so I've been featured in a couple of magazines and shit. And by public, you know, I sort of like reflected on that. It's like the white mainstream public. It's like a success, like a fucking Washington Post and shit. And that's great. But like, what is the effect of the black folks, or the effect of these dinners on the black folks in the room? And are we? And his question to me was like, that made me realize, like, despite my efforts, am I repurposing? I'm sorry. Am I just perpetuating the same sort of white supremacist, non-revolutionary, non-radical attitudes, or am I effecting like critical, necessary change? And I don't know. I do know that the dinners, not to discount people's presence, I do know that the dinners, if they are effective, the efficacy is limited. And I know that what is necessary is what is impossible. But it's still necessary. And that doesn't, I mean, Jay-Z said, difficult takes a day, impossible takes a week, you know? So it's possible, you know? But I think we have to approach the work from the lens of impossibility, so that we know what is required of us, and so that we don't like continue to assume the same positions, the same frame, and sort of the same conception of reality if we want to change reality. So, I mean, that's it. That's what I have to say, and then we can have like a little Q&A and shit. But thank you.
Thank you.
Tunde, question.
Yeah.
So on Wednesday
conversation not being focused on food, right? Even though you came down here as a Nigerian chef to share your expertise with us, right? So why was that?
Do you mind standing up and just repeating the question?
Yeah. So on Wednesday, you were very intentional about our conversation not being focused on food, right? And especially being that you were a Nigerian chef coming here to share some of your expertise with us, right? So why was that? And I guess the second part of that question is maybe do you feel like there's a certain like maybe tokenism of sort of like I don't know specialty cuisine and how it's shared with people here?
Yeah, thank you. So when I started cooking, I made a conscious decision not to talk about the food because I think that was part of the problem with contemporary American food. There was an overemphasis on what was on the plate to the exclusion of everything else. And when and also like just the what Nigerian food is for me and for people who eat Nigerian food. Growing up, as nobody talked about, your mother didn't feed you like beans, and you're like, I mean, I can taste hints of paprika. It's like, shut the fuck up and like eat that food. That's what it was, right? There wasn't any parsing of flavors, which I think is like this sort of mechanistic approach. I think it's just the American way, like to break things down. And so that was my decision. And I think it is possible that throughout this evening I'm going to be referencing Justin, because during our conversation yesterday, he told me and he challenged me, and this is something that I've held for like 3 years, like not to talk about the food, and he challenged me to talk about the food more as a way to connect my experience with the experiences of African Americans in the room. And I realized the language that I didn't have at the time when I decided not to talk about the food was the way whiteness consumes stuff, and the way and how quickly things are turned into commodities. And I was reading something today separate from race, and it talks about commodity fetishism. And what that means and what I found is it's a way to extract value from something so that you can aggrandize yourself and so that you can give yourself a certain cachet. Like I tried Nigerian food, exoticizing the food and creating like a distance that is insulting because the food isn't exotic. The food isn't different. The food is contemporary. It's happening right now as we speak. People are eating Nigerian food somewhere. So that was why I did that. But I think moving forward that I have to strike a balance. Going back to my initial perspective, which is I want to make Nigerian food commonplace. At least that was then, without making it pedestrian. I was saying I want to, as much as I can, as one person who's cooking for people. Push back against this idea of like commodification and just like non-intentional consumption as a way to like take and just leave the husk of something remaining. So
yeah. And I think to me that there's a relationship to that, and what's seen, at least since I've been here in Durham, as kind of like a local food movement, is void of. It's like what happens when gentrification happens. Like a historically black neighborhood that's got like all this kind of flavor with like, Buicks in the front yard and funky couches on the porch, and then gentrification happens and you see all these kind of box things that look the same. It's like it just loses its flavor, and I think like when, like in my food work, we hear a lot of white folks ask like, why are there a lot of black folks or people of color involved in the food movement? Because it just don't have that kind of flavor. It's like it's a gentrified version of what used to be some kind of soul food Southern culture that's now you know. You know? So, yeah. Crazy, I heard
But the thing about kale is African Americans used to use kale, and now it's been
yeah. So it's what's lost is why we're not involved. I mean, we don't want to be involved in something that don't got the soul that we're used to bringing to, and the flavor and the this, and then this magnified into something that we're just not familiar with and attached to in a more traditional and cultural way.
And black folks have also been purposefully excluded
And there's
because of the compensation that comes with doing good work.
right, and the exploitation of the labor that's associated.
Yes. Do you mind standing and just?
No.
Can you say your name?
My name is Nelly and I'm from Kenya. So it was very interesting to hear what you're saying about being African but not being African American. And you spoke about Africans not feeling like they're kin with African Americans.
Specifically, I can only speak for like the folks that I know. I don't know about.
Well, it's my experience as
Yeah.
well. So it resonated with me. And the question I have is, should we? Because sometimes I feel like I'm cheating. When I think about we suffered colonialism and post-colonialism and neo-colonialism and all that, but isn't 400 years of slavery? So I don't know whether by feeling black and associating with African Americans, I'm appropriating something that I have no business appropriating. I don't know whether you get the question.
Do you get your question? I think.
The question is it right for me to want to feel black and associate with African Americans? Am I passing off as having experienced something that I haven't? And how do I relate to them in this?
Yeah. So I mean, to be specific, I'm not saying to present as African American because I want to keep my own heritage. I'm saying because my experience with my family, my friends, is this hypersensitivity to race. So like if I'm like hanging out with if I'm calling my mom who lives in Nigeria and she's like, oh, so what are you doing? I'm like, I'm driving with a friend. She's like, who's your friend? I'm like, Mommy, you don't know them because you don't know my friends. But then she's like, are they black or white? I'm like, they're purple. Because I'm like, why are you asking that question? Like, I don't understand like why it's necessary. And so like those things and then like these like subtle warnings like, oh, don't hang around black people or like shit like that. And to be fair, a lot of my African folks are also like, they also don't like white people too. So, but I think it's like, it's especially tragic that they make those statements about black folks when, at least in Nigeria, the most like transformative and transgressive symbol of Nigeria and even like sort of like African liberation in sort of like contemporary times in the 70s up until now is Fela Kuti. And he was only able to sort of like become politicized and sort of like develop this sort of colonial or anti-colonial, anti-white supremacist like conception of himself because he was educated in America by a black woman about black power, our black the Black Power movement, and his music when it sort of like moved away from a derivative of popular American music and moved to a more like militant pose was because of like James Brown and James Brown's influence on him. So we have like the legacy of African American struggle in our struggle, and we also have and it goes both ways that Malcolm X and other black leaders were influenced by the independence movement in Africa and also influenced it. So we do have a choice, but part of the choice that we have is a choice that is already there for us. There's a history of like connection. I mean, contemporary connection, and of course the historic connection of, you know, the severing of these people by the slave trade. You know, so I'm not talking about co-opting the African American experience. I'm talking about solidarity, because the stuff that affects us on the continent, you know, is happening. It's similar. So, yes.
Similarly to what you were saying, the young lady, because we're West Indian, and it was like